All right, so this is, I believe, the last long presentation on federal job guarantee, and then we'll have a roundtable. So I'm gonna I will offer my remarks in a broader political economy frame, with federal job guarantee being a subset of what me and some colleagues, particularly at the institute that I direct, the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy. Notice how I emphasize that word power and political economy. Kind of ironically, when you look at a lot of institutes, the word power doesn't appear in the names. But almost everything that we're doing here is about power. Power as an input, power as an outcome. The ability to affect things, the ability to have agency. And federal job guarantee is a key element with regards to that framing of power. So I'm going to talk a lot about inclusive economic rights. Some of this can be found in a Journal of Economic Literature's publication that's appearing this month, that's co-authored with my colleagues Grieve Chelwa and Jim Stewart. It's called Stratification Economics, Core Concepts and Policy Implications. A lot of people to thank, but I know we're running a little late on the program. Let me just say that I'm talking about federal job guarantee, and I'll say a lot of things, and they'll come from my mouth, but they're built upon the work of so many. The Levy Institute in particular has done some yo men type work, yo men and yo women, yo person type work in building this field around the federal job guarantee with the research, the simulations, and larger macro implications, but there are many others I could thank as well. So the emergent political consensus, driven by largely economists, is based on the view that markets and marketized solutions are what is best for our economy and distributional sorting. This orthodoxy is grounded in a dogma. It's purported as a science, but it's a dogma. It's a faith that markets are somehow natural, transparent, efficient, and inevitable. But the belief does not give enough credence to the reality, the political actions that form and codify markets in the first place. Basically, even a farmer's market is a political construction. The ability to trade an apple is often facilitated with a permit. So our understandings of markets, of economics, being separable from politics, and a key element that I'm going to add today, identity group stratification, is a farce. So it won't be novel if I tell you that politics and economics are related. It won't be novel if I tell you that gender and politics or race and economics are related. But what I believe the world needs to grasp is that all three have always been iteratively related as it relates to our well-being. So we have this presumption that markets are simply natural. It leads to a false notion of fairness, that somehow if each individual is free to pursue their own profit and happiness, then that will ultimately lead to a greater good for society. But as inequality continues to grow both within and across nation states, the economics profession and society writ large needs to move beyond a neoliberal political economy framing that centers markets and individual choice, devoid of any adequate understanding of the roles of resource, power, and distribution, towards a new thinking, a more moral and fair political economy grounded in what we're labeling inclusive economic rights and shared prosperity. We need to expand the boundaries of human capital theory to better theorize the roles of politics, social, and economic power, and how that power and endowment that people start with can adjust and alter the rules and structures of markets, transactions, in order to privilege that power and capital in the first place. This is especially true when we consider identity group economic disparity. So what do we have? We don't have an adequate social safety net in place. What we have is over 5 decades of deregulation, protections of private property, militaristic public investments, yet we also have public budget austerity, especially when it comes to investing in the environment and social programs, and a market revolution supported by a neoliberal vision of supply-side economics under the lure that the structures and government subsidies that benefit corporate interests would generate a market dynamism of economic activity that's going to trickle down and lift all proverbial boats. Yet many Americans, Black and brown families in particular, they have low wealth, low income, inadequate health care, and are unemployed, underemployed, and when they do work, they work in precarious, but based on this last pandemic, essential jobs that have fewer workplace protections, lower wages, and lower benefits. We know that racism, sexism, and other isms, they're not simply irrational prejudices, but rather long-leveraged strategic mechanisms used for exploitation and extrapolation that have benefited some at the expense of others. In a just world, one's race, one's gender, one's ethnicity, one's nativity would have no transactional value whatsoever in relation to material outcomes. Conventional economics views race prejudice as some exogenously determined binary that represents a preference, a taste, a bigotry, or an ignorance that somehow should be arbitraged away by non-bigoted, profit-seeking individuals or efficient firms. This ignores the strategic agency and benefits that individuals have in choosing and investing in a collective group identity, and how social structures may increase or decrease the value and incentives associated with that investment in that identity. Indeed, this is the impetus for the psychological and material benefits that we label white privilege, or the property rights and whiteness. But we should note that this privilege is based in an immoral notion of benefit, an immoral notion of benefit that is largely predicated on self-interested tribal norms in which accumulation knows no bounds. But what's particularly at issue is government's complicity in generating and facilitating extreme economic and racial inequality. I dare say understanding persistent and extreme inequality and the pivotal roles that race and other group identities like gender, disability status, and sexual orientation play in forging political alignments and economic divisions, that should be the core and the mission of economists, social scientists, and university communities in general. I believe we should embrace principles around morality, decency, and economic sustainability in a vision and a plan to address inequality in our political economy. These values are critical for defining, and we get to choose this, economic good, and promoting authentic coalition across race, across gender, and sexual orientation to address common and growing inequality. But to be clear, I'm not calling for the end of identity or affinity groupings, but rather an end to their importance as they relate to material outcomes. We need a deeper understanding of how devaluing individuals based on race, gender, and sexual orientation, how they relate to political notions of who's deserving and who's not deserving. That's essential to expand beyond conceptions of individual transactions into workings of larger political economy structures that will affect us all. In the US, the last half century of policy has exacerbated precarity and generated a structure where essentially all of our nation's productivity gains have gone to the elite and upper middle class, while effectively flatlining real worker wages for everyone else. That's resulted in an obscene, undemocratic, and dysfunctional concentration of both wealth and power, especially by race, that we haven't seen since the Gilded Age. The EPI, the Economic Policy Institute, they have a well-cited productivity pay gap report that traces this relationship between economic growth and worker compensation since the mid-20th century, and find that between the periods of 1948 and 1979, a period we could label the post-New Deal period, a period that we can also characterize with dramatic economic growth, we have productivity rising by over 100%, while at the same time worker compensation rose by nearly 100%, 93%, That's almost a one-to-one relationship between growth and worker productivity. We can contrast that with the period between 1979 and currently, a period that we can label the neoliberal period, characterized by supply-side economics. In that period, productivity rose by about 70%, and worker compensation rose by nearly 11%. So in response to that Gilded Age that I referenced and the Great Depression that nearly brought down the American economy, the New Deal reined in unfettered capitalism and corporate consolidation and provided a balance of power between labor and capital and set a foundation for a strong labor movement. This form of stimulus provided a more efficient multiplier and a stimulus that was more balanced in its growth and one that promoted shared prosperity. But let's turn back to race. It was not coincidental that both by design, implementation, and management, black people and black institutions were excluded from much of the gains, particularly in the form of wealth, from the New Deal and labor movements. I can cite the passage of the 1935 National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, which guaranteed the Americans the right to organize and collectively bargain. It served as a safeguard for workers against corporate exploitation. But because of the Faustian bargain to convince particularly Southern legislators and an apartheid-like Southern Jim Crow to come abroad with the passing of the Wagner Act, black Americans were largely excluded from these protections. For instance, the Wagner Act excluded domestic and agricultural workers who, in the 1930s, 90% of black women who worked were employed as an agricultural domestic worker, and over half of black men. But there's nothing new about this concept, or even radical, about the concept of economic rights. FDR, in his 1944 State of the Union address, he called for an economic bill of rights, where he said, quote, "We need physical security, economic security, social security, and moral security." He knew that full citizenship demanded more than political rights, it required economic rights. The first article of Roosevelt's proposed Second Bill of Rights was the right to employment. Also, in the wake of World War II and the dismantling of a fascist Nazi regime, the United Nations General Assembly issued the landmark Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which included economic rights in 1948. Human rights were described to be universal and related to the maintenance of human dignity, and nation states had a responsibility to deliver those human rights. The United Nations Human Rights Declaration, it identified 5 categories: civil, political, social, cultural, and the one that we often forget, economics. Articles 23 and 25 speak specifically to economic rights. Article 23 says everyone has a right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and protections against unemployment. Article 25 says everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, and other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond one's control. That concept of economic rights has deep civil rights history in the United States. The Reverend Martin Luther King, he pushed for a guaranteed job and guaranteed income in his final years. Basically, policy deliberations on ending poverty and reducing inequality should be anchored in the idea of inclusive economic rights as the basis of a moral economy. Rather than empowering the poor, what we do today is we manage them. Race, along with government social programs, they're scapegoated to fuel that neoliberal agenda I've been describing. Poverty and inequality are attributed to deficiencies internal to the poor and blacks themselves. We stigmatize people based on their race, and anti-blackness is strategically used as that political fodder to implement harsh and punitive control on the underclass. Blacks have become the symbolism of undeserving welfare queens, deadbeat dads, and super predators by which we define a surplus population. We characterize them as persistently unemployed, unemployable, a source of urban crime and malice, and whose subsistence needs we deem a drain on our fiscal budgets. That is the fuel for austerity policies. If behavioral modification, particularly with regards to personal and human capital investments, if that's the central issue, why should we fund government agencies and programs which at best misallocate resources to irresponsible individuals and at worst create further dependencies to fuel irresponsible behaviors? The political economy framing that I've been describing is based on a rugged individualism, personal responsibility, and laissez-faire economics. It presents market allocations as the ideal solution for all our problems, economic and otherwise. The concept of individual price takers as baseline doesn't adequately account for power and capital. Markets, whether they're product markets, labor markets, financial markets, they're presumed to be self-regulating, fair, colorblind arbiters that reward hard work and sanction those that do not put in the effort. The most astute, the most valued, the hardest workers, they're believed to prosper and endure, while on the flip side, the market is supposed to sanction and discipline the least astute, the least valued, and the laziest people amongst us. In this system, words like freedom and choice have become weaponized as rhetorical devices intended to appeal to one's desire to have agency in one's life and not be a victim. It feeds into a proverbial American narrative that through hard work and effort, individuals can turn their proverbial rags into riches. We offer individual anecdotes as evidence of the power of effort and free market efficacy. But what we don't offer in that neoliberal paradigm is the systematic evidence of the countless cases of hardworking individuals who are not able to attain social mobility, and likewise the anecdotes of the individuals who are born into privilege and able to maintain that privilege regardless of effort or ingenuity extended. The presumptions pay little attention to power and capital, recognizing that laissez-faire market approach is inadequate to break the iterative manner in which capital, wealth, and power concentrate for some and exclude others should be the work that we do. We should contend that public interventions are necessary to break up persistent group inequality. Existing distributions are the products of often racialized, exploitive, and extractive histories. As such, a rebalance of power and public intervention is necessary. That neoliberal framing that it naturalizes poverty and inequality by castigating it as the result of unproductive and deficient behavior. That is, the subpar outcomes, they're seen as resulting from personal choices of individuals and communities. But an inclusive economic rights frame turns all of that on its head by locating poverty and inequality as resulting from an absence of power and resources. That is, poverty and inequality are the result of policy choices that deny people the resources they need to live meaningful lives. The frame calls for government to end poverty directly by placing resources, in the case of this discussion, a job, in the hands of people as a right. We need to do better in understanding these roles of power and capital. We should recognize that atomistic agents floating in unfettered markets guided by free will into fair and efficient allocation isn't reality. Choices limited for individuals who lack basic resources, such as a job, such as shelter, food, and health care. In essence, rather than benefiting from markets, they're at the whim of markets. Authentic freedom and agency is rooted in resources, political resources, social resources, psychological resources, and especially material resources. And in essence, without these resources, people don't benefit from markets. They're either at the whim of charity or exploitive agents in those markets that do have resources. There's a baseline set of enabling goods and services that are critical for individuals to have self-determination, without which these individuals won't reap the economic returns to their efforts or ingenuity. public intervention is needed to guarantee inclusive economic rights to counterbalance the accrued economic and racialized private power in which, in isolation, economic markets are incapable to redress. Government needs to directly compete with and crowd out inferior private options, those that don't ensure universal and quality healthcare, housing, schooling, financial services, access to capital, and free mobility without the psychological and physical threat of detention or bodily harm at the hands of a state-sanctioned terror because someone's identity is linked to a vulnerable or stigmatized group. We should initiate this inclusive economic right to a productive and quality job with the economic security of a living wage, worker amenities that provide for investments in our public, physical, and human infrastructure. A federal job guarantee would literally eliminate working poverty and literally eliminate involuntary unemployment. It would provide a public option to employment to better enable workers to bargain for decent wages and working conditions by also literally removing the threat of unemployment. In essence, workers that don't receive the program can better conditions when they're in their job with a private employer because that threat of unemployment is relaxed. And it would provide an automatic stabilizers by literally eliminating cyclical unemployment, regional unemployment differences, and structural unemployment writ large. Having Americans out of work does immense damage to the human spirit, and it imposes extensive costs to individuals, families, communities, and society as a whole. We've tried minimum wage laws, which are good offensive strategies, but they're not bold enough. They still leave many workers unemployed and out of the workforce altogether. This proposal that I'm putting forth is not an employer of last resort program, but a viable alternative to undesirable low pay, low benefits, and poor working conditions. To be clear, I'm not talking about welfare to work or workfare, rather an authentic right to work for decent wages on a productive job to enhance our infrastructure. What we have in mind is more extensive than local job training and search assistance programs that don't ensure employment. You know, it's cruel to have somebody go through training and there not be a job waiting for them at the end. Many skill building and workforce development initiatives leave intact the structural barriers to employment. Workers would benefit a great deal more if going through that training, there's a productive job waiting for them at the end. The jobs themselves would address our 21st century physical and human capital infrastructure needs. It would include the universal provision of care work and invest in our increasing vulnerability to natural disaster resulting from unnatural climate change that all require substantial public investments. The jobs could be construction jobs, investment in education, health services, supportive housing, libraries, child and elder care, arts and culture, projects designed to transform our cities to green, emission-free municipalities that leave us more resilient and more sustainable. The work could include disability-centered advocacy and facilitate long-term solutions towards dignified employment, livability, financial independence. Similar programs could be designed to transition people who have been incarcerated. In general, we could invest in our human infrastructure with high-quality, universal pre-K child care, elder care. This would also be gender conscious because we have a patriarchy that unfortunately renders a lot of care work to women. Federal government, states, Indian nations, local municipalities, and community councils, they can conduct inventories of their needs and develop a list of tasks that need to be done to enhance our productivity and infrastructure. We could assign priority to the most urgent projects in the most distressed communities. The work would be offering medical coverage, retirement support, paid family leave, sick leave. And then let's talk a little bit about stimulus. So stimulus plans championed on both sides of the political aisle often use tax incentives and deregulation to cajole and bribe a private sector that often is accruing record-breaking profits to provide more jobs and rebuild our nation's crumbling infrastructure. The problem with this approach is it leaves workers vulnerable to the whimsical nature of trickle-down, as well as the instability of contingent work that doesn't ensure that they'll be employed full-time. Moreover, it's often a transfer of the value of our public infrastructure to corporate interests with no guarantee that the infrastructure itself will actually get built in the first place. In contrast, a federal job guarantee would provide a direct source of employment, and it would trigger a multiplier stimulus effect across our entire economy and enable all workers, particularly those at the low end of the labor market, to bargain for better wages and benefits, again, without that fear of being destitute from the threat of unemployment. It would structurally change the U.S. economy away from low-wage work towards more moderate and high-wage jobs and provide a buffer against the pending transition in employment due to automation and technological change. The moral hazard problem associated with the implicit promise of a bailout to the financial sector when we have a time of economic crisis, well, that would be dramatically curtailed. Basically, a federal job guarantee would buffer our economic vulnerability from the risky, so-called too big to fail moral hazard associated with sometimes finance and Wall Street. Not only would the jobs restore psychological balance to the millions of unemployed workers and individuals who desire to work but cannot, it would also address our long-standing unjust and discriminatory barriers that keep large segments of stigmatized populations out of the labor markets. It would reverse the rising tide of inequality for all workers by strengthening their labor market bargaining power. And it would ensure that the United States live up to the unfunded mandate that would actually achieve full employment and eliminate involuntary unemployment outlined in that landmark legislation of the 1978 Humphrey-Hawkins Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act. So let me wind down. Our current economic system has been founded and grounded in values of self-interested accumulation, and that has left us vulnerable to ideals of greed and exploitation. We emphasize growth as our North Star without any explicit expression to economic well-being. In isolation, growth fails to adequately capture the multiple dimensions of prosperity, including human capabilities, morality, sustainability, as well as civic engagement. We need an economic policy that centers people both domestically and abroad, as well as our environment. We need to learn from the failures of the past, and this worker-centric physical and human infrastructure package, it needs to be made permanent, and it should be by design, implementation, and management intentionally inclusive or intentionally anti-racist and anti-sexist. With this approach, it would trend us towards dismantling the material consequences and social stigma associated with identity groupings that we label racism and sexism. We would need to reject the empirically unsubstantiated rhetoric that ignorance and so-called grit and personal responsibility are the sources of inequality. So I have a call to arms in closing. And that call to arms is for us to commit to justice. Commit to justice as a matter of faith, simply because it is the right thing to do. People in this room are well equipped to fuse insights from their various trainings to improve our humanist, our social, scientific, and political understandings of group-based stratification in local, national, and international contexts. We should use our vast and highly subsidized resources to produce high quality and impactful work to generate innovative strategies, policies, and investments to break down restrictive hierarchies, to empower people, and to move society towards greater equity, particularly when these restrictive hierarchies relate to one's cursory identity, such as a race, gender, or sexual orientation. In the end, we get to choose. In the end, it is our economy, it is our monetary system, and it is our government. Thank you very much. Oh, question. Thank you. Yes, questions. Should I call or we'll go up? We go 1, 2. I saw a hand, and then 3.
I was just thinking about when you were talking about neoliberalism, whether you had connected that at all to public choice theory from James McGill Buchanan and Democracy and Change, because I just kept flashing on that.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant point. I mean, scholarship itself is not the result from pure science. Scholarship itself is grounded in politics, and then the point I'm also trying to make, the ways in which we have always divided people into identity groups. And that book, Democracy and Change, I find brilliant. I think it does some historical archival work to uncover a trajectory and a planned political strategy to purport science. In fact, I dare say that modern day economics is purported as a science. So how many people have a bachelor's in science degree in economics? Just curious. Can you get a bachelor's of science degree in sociology and political science? I mean, there's something about our discipline that has purported itself. We use a lot of math. We use a lot of modeling. But to believe that any ideas around production, distribution is not grounded in some normative aspects, that it's strictly positivist, is a misnomer. Indeed, we get to choose. I keep saying that, but what are the 2 welfare theorems of economics? The first one is, and now I might mess myself up because I've been removed from graduate school for so long, but the Pareto optimal concept of not making somebody better off without making someone worse off. And then what's the other second theorem? If we had reached a distribution and started with a different allocation, we would still reach that same level of distribution in the end. Tell me those aren't normative perspectives. Tell me you can't come up with different sets of norms to lead you to different sets of theories that might lead to a different political economy. So to me, that's a key point. All knowledge is normative. Even science knowledge is normative. And this indeed is the value of diversity and inclusion. My experiences growing up are going to be different than other people's experiences growing up. So the extent to which I have pathway to be able to desegregate elite environments, not only is it just, which like I've been trying to compel on you, that should be reason enough, but it potentially could have the additional impact of bringing new perspectives that challenge the status quo and move us in ways that we otherwise wouldn't have moved because we're bringing in people with the same perspectives. Oh, sorry. And please help me because I'm going to forget what's the order. So.
No worries. Thank you so much.
And can y'all tell me your name so I can get to know you as well?
Sure.
Sorry.
I'm Marie Therese. I was curious if you'd given any thought to sort of tactics for overcoming the inevitable backlash of sort of the powers that be, so to speak, when you're advocating for this sort of an economic bill of rights. Because there's a lot of organization and sort of institutions and funding that's kind of going into an opposition here, and didn't know sort of like if you had any suggestions for sort of how on the path to building power on the other side you sort of protect yourself from that sort of the heat from the opposition, I guess.
Yeah. So I don't have all the answers to that. I know that one needs to be strategic. One needs to seek common narratives and cooperate and The other element I'd say is try to fellowship and build trust in building these coalitions. If we look, for example, at what was cited earlier, that this didn't happen overnight, the market revolution that we have today, that it was 30 years of investments. It was coordinated strategies. What I think, and perhaps I'm proselytizing here, what we have is a commitment, or what I believe people who support this vision have, is a commitment to justice. Let me see if I can answer the question more directly and succinctly. One needs to be strategic. One needs to be realizing that Overton moments occur in unpredicted ways. So, if we were in South Africa pre the ending of apartheid, I suspect they wouldn't have predicted the date that apartheid would have ended, but there were probably geopolitical reasons that led to the decline of apartheid in that structure. So I say commit to the vision and be strategic for when it occurs. Try to risk not being co-opted because I think one of the things that progressive movements suffer from is co-optation in the immediacy of urgency without having a commitment to a long-term vision. Don't compromise your values, challenge ideology, but the values themselves are norms that you get to choose. And those things shouldn't be compromised. And I guess that's the other point I'm emphasizing. We get to define the economy we want. And I commit to it, build up coalitions, and work in a persistent way till it happens. Yeah. One other point I wanted to make about that, sorry. Here's another reason how race and identity group stratification comes in. When people, there's that book, What's Wrong with Kansas? I might miss the title up, but the notion that there's a lot of poor white people, there's a lot of white people without jobs, there's a lot of white people that have low wealth, there's a lot of white men that don't have wealth in this country. So why would they seemingly go with a policy perspective that seems to be counter their economic personal goals? Relative status. That as society becomes more unequal, we're also susceptible to the lure of relative status. Sadly, especially with a tribalistic framework, the more unequal we are, the more we are susceptible to the lures of white supremacy, because white supremacy has material benefits. There is an actual benefit associated with not being the last fired in an economic downturn, or the last hired and the last fired in economic cycles. First fired and last hired, thank you. So I guess this is where identity group stratification comes in. One way that one can consolidate power at the top is to set up colonial structures that pit people that aren't as elite against one another by offering one group relative status against the other. Yeah. I think we had here and then back here. Yep, here and then.
I'm James Keenan. Just wanted to note that I'm one of a couple of Duke School alumni in the audience.
I love it.
In your discussion of the job guarantee, you made no specific reference to modern money theory or to the arguments on behalf of the job guarantee that flow from MMT, and specifically the notion that to put it in extreme shorthand, that taxation leads to unemployment. And I'm wondering, and I can understand that for many of the audiences that you might address, you wouldn't really need to make reference to a specific theory of unemployment. But I'm wondering if you have any particular areas of agreement or disagreement with the, with sort of an MMT-inflected discussion of job guarantee, such as Randy or Pavlina Cherneva might put forward.
So those are my allies. I wouldn't purport myself to be as astute in MMT as they are, so I have my own limitations. But and there's certain aspects that I believe wholeheartedly. For example, a job guarantee are productive investments, so the inflation aspects of it are curtailed as opposed to if money was created to things that were less productive. The notion that taxation leads to unemployment, I don't believe that to be always the case. I think certain taxation doesn't necessarily lead to unemployment, and I also think taxation is necessary for political reasons. Frankly, I think there's too much political concentration at the top, and a wealth tax is useful regardless of whether it generates federal reserves to pay for other things, but rather simply allowing that accumulation of economic power in perpetuity limits our capacity to do things in a policy way to benefit us all.
Thank you.
I think.
Over here and then over there, sorry. Yep.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Odysseus. So my question to you is a bit more theoretical, but I'm interested in your opinion. A problem we always have and had is that structural change requires a crisis, requires some kind of a shock that creates the political momentum and raises the saliency of an injustice or of a challenge to the extent that the political system mobilizes after a pressure from social movements, and there is some kind of reform in a direction that satisfies the demands of those below. And hearing you, I was thinking that an economic bill of rights is such a massive transformative change that cannot simply fall from the sky. Like, it requires a social movement that sustains a certain amount of pressure to the extent that it becomes very costly for the political system to ignore this sort of demands. So my question to you is, are we destined to wait for the next crisis in order to stimulate the changes that we want?
Yeah.
Or you think that it's possible to have different sort of strategies that are kind of more incremental in the medium to the long term?
Yeah.
Open window.
Yeah, you said it. I think economic crises present opportunities for upheaval of economic and political systems. However, it's not only economic conditions, it could be geopolitical. A lot of the civil rights advancements in America were the result of, I dare say, the Cold War and America's image in a global stage. So I don't have complete predictability of when those moments occur, but I do know that as a movement, we are too susceptible to the immediacy of now and a myopic notion of what's possible, a pessimism that deters us from being able to achieve these goals. That pessimism literally only satisfies the status quo. And it's a pessimism that's been captured in our imaginations of what is possible and not possible, right? That dogma of markets is presented to us as inevitable, natural, and the only prospect. But the long life of economics as a profession goes well beyond this neoliberal period, and it is probably short in our long span of economics where we've considered other types of political economy. So the challenge for us, I think, is that political movement with some patience, with some commitment and steadfastness, and willingness to take some losses. There might be some electional losses. I mean, I don't have the exact mix of pragmatism and vision and commitment, but always adhering to the lesser of two evils is not a strategy, a successful strategy. I think there was a question back over here somewhere.
Oh, yeah. This is perhaps peculiar to the United States and our heterogeneous population. Like, there are people here from countries where it's a little more homogeneous. I am skeptical of the power of relative status in explaining things, or the concept of relative status in explaining things. I was in the Army with a lot of poor white guys, poor black guys, and at the time, poor Hispanic guys like me. And those are the only people I was in the Army with. There wasn't anybody in the top 20% in my company. And relative status almost feels like a creation, like a purely academic concept, ungrounded, empirically ungrounded. For some reason, it's making me think of, and this will be very particular to America, the arguments over the term Latinx. You know, and there's these surveys that show that 3% of Hispanic or Latino people identify that way, broadly. But people in graduate school, it's 90%. So I think also that the relative status thing takes us away from meeting a person who's in the lower class, one-on-one, human to human. I'm not saying it's not there. I'm sure it affects some people, but I don't know how useful it is as a concept. Because it just wasn't anything that I encountered in any of the guys I was with.
Yeah.
Ever.
Right, so I'll say a few things. One is the empirically ungrounded. So if I tell you that college-educated black people have less wealth than white people who dropped out of high school, if I tell you that the unemployment gap is twice as high for black people as white people at every level of education, if I tell you that the risk of mortality between a black person aged 25 to 60 is about 50% higher than a white person, and that risk climbs to 75% when we look at college-educated black people relative to college-educated white people, I will push back on your notion that it's not empirically substantiated. If I tell you...
All that I know.
Okay.
This is stuff that I'm aware of.
Okay.
What I'm saying is, in discussion and in messaging and in...
So that's different.
Yeah.
So there's empirical... So the first thing was, let me get to the messaging,
Right.
but
Okay.
the notion that it's not empirically grounded, I dare say that's not true.
No, I know there's
Okay.
differences in relative status. What I'm saying is, in rhetoric, in communication,
Okay,
of
all right.
ideas, focusing on this...
That's fair. So you're making a narrative argument.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to root out the notion that it is empirically grounded. Okay. We're not in dispute of. Let me say that one of the biggest privileges associated with being white in America is a raceless identity. The ability to walk through society and be the standard and the norm and not have to consider your identity as it relates to transaction or interaction, whether it matters or not. Let me say some other things. The notion that identity group stratification is unique to the United States, I don't believe to be true. I believe every society you go to, whether it's race, nativity, height, attractiveness, humans have subdivided people into identity groups, and treatment has varied in various ways. Let me also say that, to me, the most potent weapon against white supremacy, male supremacy, or any type of ism is an inclusive economic rights framework. It's not enough, but as we become more vertically unequal, people will be willing to trade off their absolute status for relative status. That's the proposition, that's the theory. Now we can test it, we can see if that's true or not, but I think history has shown us that. How was it that Nazi Germany was able to compel a whole population to engage in such immoral acts? I think it would be naive if we didn't consider coming out of World War I as an attribute that let that society be susceptible to some of those atrocities. Of course, there were many other things that took place. What else do I want to say? But, you know, you're right. There needs to be narrative work. We need to engage in the work if we want to build movements. And how do we put forth a narrative? And here's what I think. I think right now that neoliberal framing of how value is determined has captured our imagination in a way where we focus on one attribute of human nature to the detriment of other attributes of human nature. Humans have empathy. Humans have desires for common humanity. But if we have a society that teaches us, me, the individual, self-interested person, that rugged individualism, that narrative, I think is also something that needs work. We need to consider the ways in which addressing our common climate change vulnerabilities is going to matter. Our desires to really facilitate an authentic notion of people being able to invest in their ingenuity and effort. But I honestly don't have all the answers. But
I'm not from the US, but in the UK, just to follow on from that question, you noted about the large presence of usually working class individuals in the army. And I've heard it said before in the context of the UK that a job guarantee, the army almost serves like a bit of a job guarantee because it provides further income and as a means of dignity. And if you see adverts for the army, it usually promotes that, gain some dignity just by joining this and make something of yourself. That's the message. And I'm wondering to what extent does a job guarantee undermine that? And therefore, will it make it difficult to recruit for the army? And are we likely to face opposition to the job guarantee from that perspective?
I think the answer is yes. I think some people have said tongue in cheek, even in the United States, that we do have a federal job guarantee. It's called the Army. That's right. But this is right. This is the point. If we want authentic human agency, we talk about these ideals of freedom and choice, then we should make it a real choice so that somebody really makes a choice to go to the Army if they have some alternative, as opposed to going to the Army because they had no alternative. I mean, some people have argued that militarization is the way we treat surplus populations. And we incarcerate them, we segregate them, we conscript them to our military. But if people have an authentic choice, then if they make the decision to go to the Army, if they make the decision to engage in malfeasance of crime, it would be a more authentic choice. And in my view, the distribution of people in those different elements would be more just. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Joseph. I'm originally from Korea. My question is, whenever I hear someone appeal to justice, I am sometimes confused and sometimes concerned because each person has a different concept or version of justice. Even economists are so much influenced by their own theory and schools and arena. So my question is, what if we kind of transform our discourse from justice to like a win-win? Then is it too much to distancing ourselves from our original spirit or original idea? Is it too dangerous? What do you think about that?
Yeah. So, my response would be, one, there's no such thing as an economic structure or system that's devoid of values. Perhaps some people are more upfront when they use the word justice, but as I was trying to describe with those welfare theorems of economics, that's even grounded in some notion of value. Everything has some set of norms by which you begin. What I would suggest is people be more upfront about it and not couch it as strictly positivism or science devoid of norms. The second part, oh man, my feeble mind, I'm forgetting the second part of the question. Give me a trigger word, please. Win-win, thank you. I think that this is also an ailment of the progressive movement, that we look so hard for the win-wins. Some people might have to give up something in society to get to what the masses might think is a better society. You know, a federal job guarantee is going to make us pay more for Uber. A federal job guarantee will impact the amount that some of us who are elite have to pay when we go to a restaurant. I dare say that that's a better, more moral, just society, but it won't be win-win for everybody. Perhaps if we redefine value in attributes like common humanity, sustainability, then it can be win-win. But in the current framework where value is grounded in income in a self-interested way, I don't think the society I'm talking about is going to be win-win for everybody. But if we transform our values, it very well could be.
Hi,
Darrick, this may be your last question.
Okay, so you got the pressure to make this the best question. Last one.
I think it's going to be, but I'm from Brazil, and my question is, well, the world doesn't have a state. We cannot do a job guarantee for the world. So this is a disequilibrium in the economic system, international economic system. And to be more equilibrium, the United States has to give up much of its power, economic and military power. And how do you see this international disequilibrium in power, and how can America give up his power and can be much more engaged in rearrangement the international structure to be more equal in all these countries and such a thing? I don't know if it's a good question.
I think it's a great question. So I want to make a few distinctions in trying to answer this question. Our emphasis on private property rights at the exclusion of human rights. And then also I want to talk about a Marshall Plan. So let me lead with the first one. This neoliberal paradigm has a great emphasis on government codifying and protecting accrued private property. The problem with that is that it makes no conception or understanding by the ways in which that property became distributed in the first place. Right? If you had a notion of fairness that those that work hard and the smartest ended up with their distribution, whether I agree or not, you know, that could be your conception, but the reality is that there was thievery. There was, I think in reasonable notions of fairness, there were clear cases of exploitation and extrapolation that one might argue is atrocities in the human conditions. So I think we need to add to our notions of justice in economic thinking, restorative justice. I think we need to think about, I'll dare say the word, reparations. Right? I think that if we want a moral, enlightened society, we need to do more to... Now, what does reparations do? Not only does it have the direct effect of providing restoration in the form of material to a population that might have been exploited or extracted from, but I also think it changes narratives. And one of the key points I've been trying to get across is that all these conversations around economics are never devoid of politics. And the ways in which we understand well-being and inequality makes no conception of the historical relations that led to those distributions in the first place. Well, reparations has a truth and reconciliation component where the government takes public accountability and recognition for why things are the way they are today. So you may say these are pie in the sky ideas, but you know, we get to choose and fight for it if these are the type of societies we want. But then I also want to point out Marshall Plan. I think America's best foreign policy ever was the Marshall Plan. I think that coming out of World War II, when the world was in disarray, an attempt to try to help develop other regions with the goal of promoting peace and tranquility was valuable. Now, one problem was it was limited to Europe. The Marshall Plan was not, a Marshall Plan has not been thought of in the context of Latin America or Africa or other nations in the global South. But a Marshall Plan not only benefits those other countries, but it also leverages US resources. in a way that can be productive. U.S. benefited from Europe's development and the world in general. So, we talk about trickle down. I think a better stimulus is when we invest in people and structures in a way that grow us in a more balanced way that also benefit others as well. That's my best answer for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.